Good morning. I guess my focus is on the political economy because I think that if any economist wants to have an impact, they really have to do it working with politics, through politics, because they're joined at the hip, and no more so than in the Eurozone, because the Euro was created as an act of political will. There was nothing economically rational about it whatsoever. And we have obviously discovered that. Many people said it at the time. It was not economically rational because we know now, and a lot of people knew then, including some founders of the Euro, that a monetary union has to be backed by a fiscal union, and a fiscal union has to be backed by a political union, because a fiscal union requires transfers of wealth, and a transfer of wealth requires social cohesion, where somebody can stand up and say, I'm a European first, and a German or a Greek or a British person second. And that hasn't happened, and so there was a structural flaw right at the start. There was a second structural flaw, which was that the economies in the Union weren't really sufficiently converged. And actually, worse, the creation of the Euro has made them diverge. The productivity gap between the stronger countries and the weaker countries is much greater now than it was at that time of the creation. And one of the reasons for that is because the Euro gave cheap money to the weaker countries and therefore let them off the hook on structural reforms that they needed to converge. So the market assumed that having the same currency meant having the same credit risk, and that was essentially the structural flaw. So having started with a flawed instrument, we find ourselves now in a crisis. And what were the lessons from the 2008, 2009 period of how should politicians manage a crisis in the market? There are a few rules. Act quickly, overshoot market expectations, be comprehensive, see off all your avenues of weakness, and for heaven's sake, don't squabble about it in public. So every single rule in the management of the Eurozone crisis has been broken. Not a single one has been fulfilled. The only recent thing that has been done sensibly is the ECB, not politicians, the ECB's decision, Mario Draghi's, in fact, decision to give infinite liquidity, cheap liquidity to the banking system, which overshot market expectations. It's, of course, not comprehensive, not permanent, and not a fix, as I'll go on to talk about. And really, why is it that politicians have been unable to learn these lessons of crisis management? It's because of the nature of politics, which is why we go back to the importance of the political economy. The thing about politics is you don't get rewarded for averting a disaster, particularly if that prevention has a cost. Because if the cost and the implications of a disaster are not obvious to the public, then essentially they won't see what you've done and you don't get rewarded for it. So the real problem of politics is you can never prove the counterfactual. You can never say, I did it and it cost, I know you don't understand, but actually something else could have been worse. So you have to let your options in politics actually increase. Your optionality increases when the disaster becomes real and the problem becomes real, because then people understand why you have to act. And that is creating a real problem. That is why the Eurozone is unable to act until, 1 minute past midnight. And that is what we're seeing. I think the real other problem in the Eurozone crisis is there isn't a single institution that is taking decisions. It's all member states. And when they are making a decision, they have to cross a border. The Germans have to sign a check for the Greeks. So they're not acting for their own people, apparently. Of course they are, but it appears like they are crossing a border to act for somebody else when their voters are in fact domestic, they're having to act internationally. So when we see the G20, for example, in 2009, which is like the pinnacle of international coordination and gave rise to lots of comment about, oh, maybe this is the new world order, we can all kind of, see better economic coordination, everybody was still acting clearly and rationally in an explicable way in the national interest, taking national actions, whether they were stimulus packages or creating liquidity, whatever it was, they were still acting nationally. Now we're asking people to cross a border, and it becomes incredibly difficult for them. So where do we go from now? Where are we now today? There are three solutions. There are only three things that have been put on the table by politicians as a solution. The first I mentioned was, well, they allowed to be put on the table the European Central Bank's liquidity support, which was fantastic. It prevented a credit crunch, which we were just inevitably kind of marching towards. And it was the right thing for the ECB to do. But it is not a solution, and nobody knows the exit from it. And the reason nobody knows the exit is the European banking system is massively over-leveraged. As a proportion of GDP, it is much larger than any other place in the world, much larger than the US. It needs to deleverage. Right now, what's been incentivized is leveraging up again. So when the Spanish auction their debt, 80% of their debt is being bought by Spanish banks using cheap money from the ECB. So they're ballooning up their balance sheet. We've now cancelled having stress tests forever. They don't appear to be, I don't know what's going to happen in the next stress test when they realize that, Spanish banks are holding so much Spanish debt. There is no exit unless you have external investors coming back ready to buy sovereign debt. So the point is there is no exit that has been agreed from this. And so we have to see it's not a solution, it's just bought the time. The second thing that has been put on the table is a little bit of money. Unfortunately, it's not enough money. So they've set up this stability fund. It has come up with some rather ill-conceived financial instruments, but it's not enough for actually the size of the problem. Because they've waited so long, going back to my earlier, because they've waited so long, what was originally a 200, 300 maybe billion euro problem is now a 2 trillion problem, because every time they fail to act, the cost of acting again has ratcheted up. Because the yield, the cost of debt keeps going up, goes down a little bit every time they do something, but it never goes back to the level that it was. So everything is becoming much more expensive, and they don't have enough funds. They're in the middle of a negotiation of the G20, talking about more funding via the IMF, because the Chinese and others are more prepared to put money into the IMF than directly into the Eurozone. We will have to wait and see if there's enough funding for that. And the third solution that has been put on the table, in particular by Germany, is the Fiscal Compact. Now, for me, the Fiscal Compact is not just, it's just deeply flawed and the wrong answer. It's actually also, frankly, quite deeply silly, because there are two things wrong with the Fiscal Compact. It has a whole set of wonderful targets, reduce your structural deficit by 0.5%, caps 3%, debt GDP cap 60%. That's all fine. In the last 10 years, no major Eurozone economy has actually abided by any of those rules, and that was in a benign environment. It is entirely unclear whether they will be able to do that in the future. In fact, chances are they won't be able to do that in the future. And I'd like to know, because this, again, the Fiscal Compact was a political act, a political decision. Why? Because Mrs. Merkel wanted to go to the Bundestag and say, look, they're abiding by these rules, they're acting like Germans, we can actually bail them out and give them money, we can share their liability. That was the purpose of it. What is she going to say in 2 years' time when nobody's actually abided by the rules? I'd like to know what she's going to say to the Bundestag at that point in time. And the second reason it's not a sensible compact is because it doesn't address one of the key problems. If you take the pigs, the Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, what do they have in common? What did they have in common as their indicator to show that they were going to have these problems? It wasn't debt to GDP. Spain had a lower debt to GDP ratio than France and other countries. It wasn't budget deficit. I mean, you know, Italy's run budget surpluses for long periods of time. What was a one common factor was a current account deficit. And a current account deficit is lack of competitiveness. And therefore the solution is structural reforms, which take a long period of time and need to be funded in the interim period with patient money. And really, that is one of the big solutions that people are coming to. And yes, it does lead to austerity, but it leads to, you know, that is an investment. That austerity is an investment in future competitiveness and future growth. So where we are right now is essentially where we've been. There is no viable solution on the table. We've bought time. We're muddling through. That is really the best, and we have now 10 years of low growth or no growth, high levels of unemployment, lots of structural reform to be done, and it's unclear whether the politics can really handle the pain, as we've seen in the case of Greece. So we haven't really solved the problem, and there's not been a resolution to solve the problem. You know, the Germans always sort of say it's better to end with a shock than to have, you know, a shock with no end, but I'm afraid we're in the shock with no end territory. So that's my thesis, which I'm very happy to be challenged on.